Hello, my name is Mitchell Smith, and today I'm going to be talking about my game, C.I.N.A.A. C.I.N.A.A. or Chess is Now an Adventure. So I made this game for my game design class this year, in which we had to take an original board game and alter an aesthetic of it so that we create our own modified version of it. So I decided to go with chess. So in order to change the aesthetic, I went from challenge to the new aesthetic of discovery. So it's a two-player game that is a modified version of chess that values journey and discovery of adventure over the strategy. The objective of C.I.N.A.A. is to be the first player to move their player piece across the game board and end on the square adjacent to their companion piece on the same row. As shown here, if your companion piece is there, you would want to end the game at that adjacent spot. Now, to set up, first the players sit directly across from each other on a play field of their choosing. Afterwards, they place the chessboard and orient the board so that the bottom right square on their side is of the lighter color. Next, each player selects both a player piece and a companion piece from the group of kings and queens. Once chosen, the players will then place their chosen player piece on their bottom right light-colored square and their companion piece directly across from it on the other side. In order to determine who goes first, the players will take turns rolling the dice. The player with the highest roll begins the game. Now, turns consist of two rolls, a movement roll and an action roll. At the start of the player's turn, they first roll a die to determine the number of squares they'll move on the board. Movement on the board consists of zigzagging through the horizontal rows of squares, starting with moving to the left on the first row and snaking through the other rows. When the player finishes moving, and they must look to see what color of the square their piece landed on. If the square is a lighter color, then the player ends their turn. If it's a darker color, they get to roll again for an action. Depending on the number rolled in the dice, the player will undergo one of 11 different actions. Once the action is completed, then the player's turn ends. After this, there are two additional rules. First of all, two pieces cannot occupy the same square. If a movement would place the player piece on an occupied square, then the player must move forward enough squares in order to land on an empty square. And landing on a darker colored square as a result of another action will not result in rolling for an additional action. Players will only roll for actions if the players land on a darker colored square as a result of their movement roll for their turn, not for an action roll. We will begin playing now. Six. With this action, the player moves forward 4 spaces, ignoring any pawns that are resulting from the 5th roll action, demolition. We've got a 12. 12 is shortcut. Now the player must roll 2 dice. If the number's even, they move forward 1 row. If it's odd, they move backwards 1 row.
It is odd, so they move back 1 row.
9. 9 is dysentery. You lose your next turn, and the opposing player will now complete 2 turns in a row.
Then we complete the first turn, and now the second.
8. 8 is the trickster. Now the player chooses a number between 1 and 6 and moves that number of squares. However, their opponent moves the same number.
5.
10 is blessings. The player now doubles the number from their next movement roll.
Their next one. Yes. So in their next movement roll on the next turn, they will double that for the movement. 5, 3, 4, 5. As you can see, since they're going to land on the other player's piece, they move to the next available one. But you get to double it. So 6. There you go. Nope, an action. It is an action.
3 is escort. Now the player now moves forward 6 squares.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
5.
5 is demolition. So the player now places a pawn in any unoccupied square on the board. When any player reaches that pawn, they must stop on the square directly before, regardless of the number of movement left in the turn. Once the player stops, their turn is over. On their next turn, for their movement roll, the player must roll 2 or higher in order to pass the pawn. If the player rolls a 1, then the player is unable to move and their turn ends. This repeats until the player rolls a 2 or higher, in which they move the number that they rolled, including the space the pawn is on. Once the player passes the pawn is removed from the board. 8, once again, is the trickster.
Let's do...
Now keep in mind, in this move,
She can only go 1 space.
even if, during an action, you're moving, you still have to stop before the pawn. In this case, the turn ends for the player, and the player begins rolling next turn to pass the pawn. Players that stop on a dark square as a result of this pawn action will not roll for an action.
So we're going to go 1.
Okay.
11 is Cursed Doll. The player now rolls 1 die, and the opponent moves back the number of die equal to the number on the die. The first player to move their player piece to the square to the immediate left of their companion piece wins the game. And that is how you play the game. Now there are a couple different actions that we did not get to, but I don't want to spoil everything for you. The player has the option to roll again or end their turn. If they decide to roll, they must first guess whether the number rolled will be even or odd. Then they roll 2 dice. If correct, their opponent moves backwards 2 rows. If wrong, they move back 2 rows. What do you decide to do?
I'm going to roll, and it's going to be even.
And it was odd. So in this case, he would move back 2. The player now moves back 8 squares. Now, with this action, the players must switch seats with each other. Players now control each other's side of the board, player piece, and companion piece. The opposing player must now begin their turn. And so, since it was his turn when he went, it's now her turn, so now she goes.